There are places in history where silence screams louder than any war drum. And tonight, I will take you to one of them. A truth buried under centuries of frost and shame. Whispers not meant for the ears of the living. If you're hearing this, it means the veil is lifting for you. Just a crack. But cracks become fractures, and once you peer inside, there is no going back. Because what the Ashford family built in the frozen woods of Maine wasn't a convent. It wasn't a retreat. It was a machine, ancient in blueprint, precise in its cruelty, and designed not for healing, but for erasure. Erasure of will, of identity, of defiance, and the world outside. It did nothing, because they wanted it, they needed it. A society built on obedience has no use for women who think, speak, refuse. The Ashford women didn't hide. They were welcomed, funded, celebrated. And while their basement echoed with the sound of butchered minds, upstairs echoed with hymns. You've been told the world is full of heroes and monsters. But the truth is, most monsters are called mother, wear crucifixes and speak with gentle voices. The truth is more sinister than any ghost story. The Ashfords weren't mad. They were lucid. Scholars of submission, artisans of institutional cruelty. And they weren't acting alone. No one builds a fortress like that without approval, without help, without a network that stretches far past the pine forests and into the very halls of power. The kind that wears robes, not rags. You may want to tell yourself this is just a story, that it happened long ago and cannot touch you. But listen closely. The methods live on, repackaged, rebranded, sanitized for modern tastes. But the root is the same. The system doesn't want individuals, it wants instruments. And you, watching this now, are not exempt. You've felt it, haven't you? That pressure behind your eyes, that sensate on that something isn't right. The sense that you're being shaped, watched, bent. The Ashfords were just an early iteration, but if you think their story ended in those woods, you don't understand how power protects its own. Welcome to the descent. You don't know it yet, but the world you believe in is about to be torn from under your feet. Keep listening, keep falling, and never, never look away. By the time the doors of St. Ursula's Academy closed behind her, Sister Margaret was no longer just a caretaker of wayward souls. She was their jailer. Behind those Gothic walls, something darker than penance lived. The corridors stretched on like veins in a dying body, and the echo of shoes on stone felt like whispers chasing one another. The nuns moved like shadows, silent and stern, never meeting the children's eyes, unless in discipline. Margaret noticed it immediately. How the girls flinched when spoken to, how they spoke in hushed tones, even when alone. There was no laughter here, only obedience wrapped in fear. Her first week, she was tasked with overseeing dormitory inspections. At night, as she moved past the rows of beds, she would catch the girls pretending to sleep, eyes squeezed shut too tightly, breaths held unnaturally still. She found drawings hidden under mattresses, crude sketches of screaming mouths, hands reaching through floorboards, and a recurring figure with a veil over its face. When she brought them to the Mother Superior, she was met with a cold stare and a warning. Imagination is a sin when it breeds hysteria. It wasn't imagination, though, at least, not entirely. The more time Margaret spent inside St. Ursula's, the more she sensed something lurking just beneath its rituals. Doors that closed themselves, hymnals that fell open to the same pages, no matter how many times they were shelved, and the old bell tower that rang once every night at precisely 3:17 a.m., though no one was ever seen pulling its rope. Margaret began to notice bruises on the girls' arms, faint fingerprints in the skin, too high to be from another child. When she questioned them, they'd look past her, terrified, as though something were listening. One night, she found herself drawn to the old records room in the West Wing, a place sealed off since the fire in 1897. Dust hung like smoke in the air, and the heavy wooden cabinets groaned with secrets. She uncovered enrollment ledgers dating back nearly a century. Dozens of names had been crossed out, not marked as graduated or transferred, just struck through as if erased from existence. No letters home, no official departures. Just gone. Margaret knew then that salvation wasn't the purpose of St. Ursula's. It was a mask, beautifully constructed, shrouded in incense and Latin prayers, to hide something far older, something predatory. The academy was not just haunted by spirits, but by an institution built on cruelty so embedded it had become invisible, routine. And somewhere in that routine, something had begun to grow teeth. Margaret tried to bring it up during supper in the refectory, carefully at first, commenting on the silence of the children, the rigidity of the schedule, the bruises. The other sisters didn't reply. They continued eating, heads bowed in prayer or pretense, chewing slowly as if every bite held back a truth they dare not speak. One of the older nuns, Sister Agnes, glanced up for just a moment, and her eyes said everything. Don't. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the meal, Margaret's plate remained half full, her appetite spoiled by the growing sense that she had stepped into a theatre where everyone played their roles to survive. Later that night, the veil of obedience lifted just slightly. A girl named Clara, small, withdrawn, maybe 10 at most, slipped a folded piece of paper beneath Margaret's door. It was a drawing again, this time more refined. A woman in a habit, but her face was missing. In its place was a hollow void, scribbled black. Behind her, dozens of children knelt with their mouths sewn shut. At the bottom, in a shaky hand, were 4 words. She watches in mirrors. Margaret checked the dormitory immediately. Clara's bed was empty. No one had seen her. No one would speak. She alerted the Mother Superior, who assured her it was likely a childish prank or a runaway's fantasy. "They do that sometimes," she said, her voice wrapped in condescension. "They vanish into the night to spite us. Most return, some don't. But that's not your concern." But it was her concern. Clara wasn't just gone. She was erased. The very next morning, her nameplate on the dormitory cubby had been removed, her belongings boxed and stored. During roll call, her name was skipped without pause. Margaret stared at the spot where she used to sit and felt a sudden pressure in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. No one else noticed, or they pretended not to. Mirrors in St. Ursula's began to change after that. Margaret would glance into one and see something off, an angle that didn't match, a flicker behind her that wasn't there when she turned around. In the chapel's sacristy, one mirror was shrouded with cloth. Curious, she asked about it. "We don't use that one," came the reply. No explanation, just avoidance, like it had always been that way. One evening, unable to contain her dread, she pulled the cloth back. The mirror didn't reflect the room behind her. It reflected a hallway she didn't recognize, lit only by candlelight, empty but somehow alive. And in the distance of that phantom corridor, a shape moved slowly toward the glass. Margaret covered it quickly and fled, but the image stayed with her. That night she dreamed of Clara walking down that same hallway, barefoot and silent, her eyes stitched closed. Margaret knew now that this place didn't just hide sins, it devoured those who uncovered them. And yet, something deeper compelled her to stay. Not out of duty, but desperation. If she left, Clara would be truly lost. If she stayed, she might be next. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could still pry the truth from the Academy's grip, before it decided to erase her too. The storm began without warning. One moment the skies were clear, and the next, rain lashed against the stained glass windows like an angry hand. Thunder rolled over the hills and echoed through the stone corridors of St. Ursula's, shaking the rafters and rattling the old bones of the place. Margaret had never seen weather shift so suddenly. It felt like the earth itself was trying to cleanse something, maybe the school, maybe its sins. The children were kept indoors, confined to their rooms with prayers and rosaries. The nuns moved more briskly now, always glancing behind them, always muttering under their breath. Margaret stayed up late that night, pacing the hallways, hoping for a glimpse of the forbidden or the forgotten. And she got it. At around midnight, while passing the chapel, she heard singing. Not the kind of choral hymn the students rehearsed, but something lower, older, almost like a chant. She pushed open the door and found it empty. No lights, no candles, just that sound, as if the walls themselves remembered a melody no one had taught them. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. There were no windows in the chapel, no wind, yet the air turned frigid. Her breath came out in mist. Margaret turned slowly and caught her own reflection in the polished brass altar cross. And behind her, a face that wasn't hers. A child, maybe Clara, with dark sockets where eyes should have been. She spun around, but the space was empty. When she looked back at the reflection, the girl was gone. The next day, Sister Agnes approached her quietly during morning chores. Her hands were trembling, her voice thin. "They'll come for you soon," she whispered. "You've seen too much, just like the others." Before Margaret could ask anything more, Agnes was gone, moving swiftly down the hall, rosary swinging like a pendulum, counting down the seconds. Margaret had to know what was being hidden. She stole a key from the sacristy and made her way to the east wing, the one that had been sealed off with nailed boards and warning signs. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. She moved past rooms that hadn't been used in decades. Desks still lined up, textbooks frozen in time. On one blackboard, in faint chalk, a phrase had been scrawled in Latin, "Non omnis moria," I shall not wholly die. Then she found it. A locked room, the door reinforced with chains and bolts. But something had broken it open from the inside. The wood splintered outward like a cage that had failed. Inside was nothing but a single chair facing a mirror, tall, antique, and cracked across the center. Margaret stepped toward it and saw her reflection split. Two versions of herself, one calm, the other terrified. And between them, again, that shape. Watching, waiting. Behind her, the floor creaked. She turned, expecting Sister Agnes or maybe one of the children, but no one was there. Only a whisper, so soft it felt like it came from inside her own skull. "She's almost here." The mirror stayed in her thoughts long after she left that room. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what she saw, not just the reflection, but the way it made her feel. Like it wasn't showing her the future or the past, but something older than time itself. Something hungry. She tried to explain it to the headmistress that evening, couching it as a concern for the safety of the students. But Mother Celeste only smiled. "Curiosity is a temptation," she said, "and temptation is the pathway to ruin." Then she placed a firm hand on Margaret's shoulder and added, "Some doors are shut for your protection." That night, the power went out. The generator failed, leaving the entire school bathed in moonlight and silence. Margaret lit a candle and wandered the halls, guided not by reason but instinct. Her footsteps echoed. Somewhere nearby, a child was crying. The sound twisted in the air, not just sadness, but something more desperate, something wrong. She followed it down into the undercroft, where the school's older foundations were hidden. Arched stone ceilings, narrow passages, and doors sealed with iron. There she found Clara. Standing barefoot on the cold floor, her nightgown soaked and clinging to her skin, eyes wide with terror. "They're in the walls," she whispered. "They talk to me when I sleep. They showed me what happened to the other ones." Margaret tried to approach, but Clara backed away. "She doesn't want you here," the girl said, voice dropping into a lower register. "You broke the rule. You saw her mirror." Before Margaret could ask more, the girl bolted into the darkness, and the walls began to move. Not physically, but perceptibly. The air pressure shifted, whispers gathered. A rhythm began, like a heartbeat, slow and heavy, pulsing through the stones. Margaret fled back upstairs. The next morning, Clara was gone. No one had seen her. No one spoke her name. When Margaret brought it up at breakfast, the other children just stared at their plates. The staff said Clara had been picked up by her parents in the night. But Margaret checked the school's ledgers. There were no records, no signature, no phone call. It was as if Clara had never existed. And in the chapel, beneath the altar cloth, Margaret found something chilling. A sketch, drawn in a shaky child's hand. It showed a girl, maybe Clara, standing beside a mirror. But the reflection didn't match. The mirror image was taller, older, with eyes that bled like open wounds. And in the bottom corner, scrawled in red ink, "She never left." Margaret couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the mirror came back. Not the way it looked, but the way it felt. Like something was waiting behind the glass, biding its time. That night, she dreamt of Clara's drawing. In the dream, The chapel stretched endlessly, the altar pulsing like a living thing, and behind it the mirror stood, not cracked, not old, but pristine, polished like a trap, and inside it, her own reflection began to smile without her. She awoke screaming. By morning, the atmosphere in the school had changed. The students walked more slowly. Conversations stopped when Margaret entered a room. Even the youngest girls, once lively and curious, now sat silent with hands folded, like they were being watched from somewhere invisible. The staff avoided her questions. Mother Celeste no longer dined with the students. The chapel was locked, and in the hallway outside her quarters, Margaret found a fresh set of wet footprints leading directly from her door and ending in the middle of the corridor. That was the day she found the second ledger. It was hidden behind a false panel in the librarian's office, tucked beneath old blueprints and religious texts. This ledger wasn't like the others. It wasn't official. It was handwritten, private, and it was old, much older than the school itself. Its pages recorded names, dates, disappearances, girls who were taken, boys who went too deep, visitors who stayed too long. Every decade had its own pattern, always one, sometimes two, always around the equinox. And on the last page, Monsieur Ashcroft, marked, observed, mirror breach. She stared at that note for a long time. Marked. The ink was fresh. The paper still smelled of iron. Someone had written it recently. Someone knew she had looked into the mirror. Someone knew what she saw. That night, Margaret returned to the chapel. She broke the lock and crept in alone. The air was colder than the rest of the building, as if the chapel lived in a different season. The stained glass was darker, the pews covered in dust, and the altar. The altar had been moved. Drag marks stretched across the floor. Beneath it, an iron ring was bolted to the stone, a trapdoor. She pried it open. A narrow staircase spiraled down, older than anything above it. She lit a lantern and descended, each step echoing into the depths. The further she went, the more the air thickened, like it remembered screams. And at the bottom, she found the chamber. It was round, carved from black rock, and utterly silent. No pipes, no wires, no dust. In the center stood the mirror. Only this time, it didn't show her reflection. What stared back at Margaret from the mirror wasn't herself. Not exactly. It looked like her, same face, same clothes. But the eyes were wrong. Too wide. Too still. The reflection didn't move when she did. It waited. And then it smiled. Behind the glass, the chamber was different. The walls weren't stone, but rotting wood, warped by water. The lantern she held in her own hand flickered, but in the mirror, it blazed like a funeral pyre, and somewhere behind her double, shadows moved, not walking but crawling, like they were being dragged by something larger. Margaret backed away, but her reflection didn't. Instead, it stepped forward, its hand pressing flat against the mirror's surface, and the glass flexed, not cracked, bent, like it was no longer solid, like it had become something thin, porous, breathing. She fled. The stairs seemed longer on the way up. Her lantern died halfway. She stumbled through the dark, scraping her palms on the stone until finally the chapel's light returned. She slammed the trapdoor shut, shoved the altar back into place, and locked the door behind her with trembling hands. But the damage was done. By morning, the staff were gone. Not absent. Gone. Their rooms were untouched. Beds still made. Clothes still folded. But no footprints, no voices, just silence. The kitchen was cold. The phone lines were dead. The youngest girls wept without knowing why. That's when Margaret decided to take the children and leave. But the gates of St. Verina's were no longer open. They stood wide as ever, but no matter which road she took, no matter how many turns or signs or trails she followed, every path led her back to the front steps of the school. She tried for hours, for days. The forest around the grounds thickened, darkened, as if reshaping itself while no one looked. Time began to warp. The sun no longer rose in the same place. The birds fell so silent. And on the fourth night, Clara vanished. She had been drawing again, alone in the library. Margaret found only the sketchbook, open to a new page. This one showed the school as it looked now. Cracked windows, black ivy choking the walls, and above the building, a mirror suspended in the sky like a second moon. Inside it, something watched. Margaret burned the page. She gathered the remaining girls into the chapel, the only place that hadn't changed. She fed them from the storeroom, read to them by candlelight, blocked every mirror, every pane of reflective glass. But still, she felt it, watching. The mirror beneath the altar had been opened. Not physically, not yet. But something behind it had started to remember the world. On the 6th night, the snow began to fall. Not gently, like a blessing, but sideways, sharp and unnatural, as though blown from the mouth of something enormous and unseen. The drifts piled high against the chapel walls, and the world beyond St. Verina's vanished beneath a shifting white veil. There were no more birds, no more wind, just the soft, endless sound of snowfall, and underneath it, barely audible, a whispering. The children heard it first. They began to hum in unison without realizing. Little songs with no melody, no rhythm, just fragments of syllables, words in a language that didn't belong to them. Margaret would find them staring into blank walls, their lips moving silently, eyes wide and unblinking. When asked what they were doing, they'd blink like they'd woken from a dream and not remember a thing. One morning, Margaret woke to find one of the older girls, Elise, standing at the altar. The child's fingers were bloody, scraped raw from clawing at the floor, trying to open the trapdoor with her bare hands. Her eyes were rolled back, but she smiled as she whispered, "She's almost here." Margaret locked the altar room and threw the key into the frozen well. She began writing letters, not to family, not to any authority, but to the future. She wrote warnings, maps of the building, instructions for sealing the chapel. She hid them in books, tucked them behind stones, sealed some in jars, and buried them in the frost-hardened earth behind the courtyard. Anything to preserve the memory of what was happening. Because by then, Margaret understood the truth. St. Verina's was no longer a place. It was becoming a threshold. Not cursed, but chosen. She didn't sleep anymore. She couldn't risk it. Dreams had started to twist. Time warped in her thoughts. She would lose hours, sometimes days, staring into a mirror she had smashed weeks ago. Once, she found herself in the library reading a book she didn't recognize, its words written in the same language the girls mumbled at night. The letters shimmered when she looked away. On the 10th night, Margaret rang the chapel bell. She wasn't calling for help. She was warning whatever listened beyond the trees. That night, the snow stopped, not gradually, but as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment the sky was thick with falling white. The next, it was black, hollow, the kind of black that makes you feel like your eyes aren't working, like you've been buried underground. The moon did not rise. There were no stars. Inside the chapel, the temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the walls like veins. Every candle sputtered and died at once, though there was no draught. And then came the knocking, soft, rhythmic, not at the door, but underneath the floorboards, as if someone or something was knocking from the crypt. Tap, 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 then silence, then again, louder. The children didn't cry. They stood in the pews like statues, staring down at their feet, as if they were listening, as if they were waiting. Margaret tried to move, to speak, to gather them, but her voice caught in her throat. Her legs would not obey her. It was like standing in a dream where everything was wrong, but nothing could be stopped. The knocking grew more insistent. Tap, tap, then pounding. The altar shook. The floor bulged. And then, a sound that didn't belong in the world. A low, wet creaking, as if ancient hinges had begun to turn. The trapdoor, sealed with iron and prayer, groaned. She had risen. No one saw her directly. Not at first. Only her shadow, cast where there was no light. A figure tall and impossibly thin, draped in something that moved like fabric but shimmered like rot. Her head was bent, as if listening to the children's thoughts. Her fingers were too long, knotted like roots. Her feet made no sound, She floated. Margaret screamed. She told the children to run, but they did not. They walked forward, glassy-eyed, hands outstretched, drawn to her like moths to flame. All except one, little Miriam. She stood at the back of the chapel, fists clenched, eyes full of tears. She looked at Margaret, not in fear, but in defiance. And then she did something impossible. She opened her mouth and began to recite scripture, not from memory, not from a book, but words Margaret didn't recognize, ancient and jagged, words that hurt to hear. The thing paused, its head tilted, the shadow recoiled, and for a heartbeat the chapel breathed. The silence that followed was total. Not the kind of quiet you find in a room, but the kind that makes your ears ring, the kind that feels like pressure in your skull. The children stopped mid-step, frozen in place like sleepwalkers on the edge of a cliff. Miriam kept speaking, though the language she spoke had no place in the modern world. It sounded older than Latin, more primal than any scripture. Each syllable struck the air like iron on bone. The shadow writhed. It began to lose its shape. First its limbs unraveled into strands of blackness like hair drifting in water. Then its form shimmered, splitting and bending, trying to hold itself together. The lightless chapel flickered as if a flame had been sparked deep within the void, and for the briefest second Margaret saw what lay behind the shadow's veil. Not a woman, not even a ghost, but something made of hunger and memory, a patchwork of grief and rage so deep it had become flesh. It had no eyes, but it saw. It had no mouth, but it hungered. And then it screamed. Not a sound exactly, more like a violation of sound, a scraping, tearing shriek that came from the bones of the building itself. Stained glass shattered, wood cracked. The crucifix over the altar split down the middle, and the holy water boiled in its dish. Margaret fell to her knees, clutching her ears, feeling blood trickle between her fingers. Miriam stood firm. The child glowed faintly now, just enough to mark her apart from everything else. Not with fire or light, but with presence. Something had awakened in her, or through her. She raised a single hand, and for a moment time buckled. Then, without warning, the chapel burst into motion. The pews splintered and flung themselves aside. The walls pulsed like lungs, and the trapdoor beneath the altar yawned wide, spewing out a wave of dark mist that stank of rot and salt and centuries-old secret. The shadow tried to retreat, back into the pit it had crawled from, but Miriam stepped forward and spoke one final word. Just one. A name. And with that name, the shadow folded in on itself like collapsing cloth, screaming as it went, vanishing back into the hole with a thunderous clap that shook the earth. The trapdoor slammed shut behind it, sealed by something far older and stronger than nails or hinges. Then, nothing. Just the soft sound of snow beginning to fall again. Margaret blinked slowly as the dust settled around her. Her body trembled with the effort of simply breathing. The chapel looked like a war zone, splintered wood, shattered glass, scorch marks carved into stone by something not of this world. But there was no sign of the shadow, no trace of its terrible form or the darkness it carried. Just the girl, standing there in the middle of the wreckage, as if she were the eye of a long-past storm. She didn't look powerful. She looked small, tired. Her dress was torn, feet bare and bleeding from the broken glass. Her arms hung limp by her sides, and her eyes were still glowing faintly, not with menace, but with exhaustion, with knowledge, with something that had seen too much. Margaret tried to speak, but found her voice cracked and dry, like her throat had been scraped raw. She crawled toward the girl and reached out, hesitant, afraid that touching her might burn. But Miriam simply looked at her, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she smiled. Not a child's smile, not innocent or sweet, but something older, something sad and accepting. Outside, the church bell rang, once, twice, as if tolling for something long buried. The children, who had been frozen in place for what felt like hours, slowly began to move again. Their eyes cleared. Confusion spread across their faces, but the fear was gone. They stumbled, dazed, unsure of where they were or why. A few of them began to cry softly. One child looked at Miriam and whispered, "Is it over?" The girl nodded once, and that seemed to be enough. Police sirens wailed in the distance now. Someone had called them. Maybe one of the nuns, maybe some terrified villager who'd heard the unnatural scream and saw the glow from the chapel windows. It didn't matter. They'd be too late, as always. Too late to witness what truly happened. Too late to understand. Margaret pulled herself upright, leaning against a crumbling pillar for support. She looked at Miriam with tears streaking down her dirt-smeared face. "Who are you?" she asked, voice barely audible. Miriam turned to her. "I'm what's left," she said quietly. "Of her. Of all of them." Then she walked down the aisle, through the broken doors and into the snow, her small figure swallowed slowly by the white silence. Margaret didn't follow. She couldn't. She knew, somewhere deep in her chest, that Miriam wasn't meant to be followed. Not anymore. Not after what she had done. They found the bodies buried beneath the foundation of the school weeks later. Contractors hired to repair the structural damage from the chapel collapse unearthed them while digging a new support line. 31 corpses, all children. Small, decayed remains curled in unnatural positions, some still clinging to rosary beads or clumps of cloth. The horror of it stunned even the most seasoned officers on site. The story made headlines across Europe. Mass grave found at Catholic orphanage. Dark secrets under St. Cecilia's. The children who never left. Margaret watched it all unfold from her hospital room, TV turned low, volume barely more than a murmur. The media swarmed. Interviews, investigations. Priests came forward to issue statements of sorrow, of ignorance. The Vatican sent envoys. Historians pulled records quietly, cautiously, tracing back the orphanage's operation over a century. The names of the dead began to surface. Some hadn't been missed. Others had been quietly erased from records, listed as runaways or relocated. No one had asked questions until now. But Margaret knew the truth didn't live in police reports or archival documents. It lived in the space between those children's bones. It lived in Miriam. No one saw her again. No sightings. No footprints in the snow. No missing child report matched her. No DNA test confirmed her identity. It was as if she'd vanished the moment she stepped into the cold. Margaret wondered sometimes if she had been real at all, or merely a vessel, conjured in a moment of need, born from the grief that soaked the walls of that place. Still, she dreamed of her. Not every night, but enough. Miriam standing at the foot of her bed, always silent, watching, as if waiting for something Margaret hadn't yet remembered. One evening a package arrived, no return address. Inside, wrapped in brown cloth and twine, was the cyan, the old journal, Sister Agnes's writings. But the pages had changed. New ink, new entries. Not Agnes's hand, a child's, scrawled, frantic at times, then careful, deliberate. A chronicle of pain, of what happened beneath the orphanage at night, of voices in the dark, of rituals forced on them by men in cassocks who smiled too much, of prayers whispered not to saints, but to something else. Margaret read it all, every word, and when she reached the final page, a simple line written in red, "They only came because we called them, and they only stayed because no one listened." She closed the book, trembling. Outside, the wind howled against the window. Somewhere, faintly, a bell rang, once. Then again, the bell was rusted through. The chapel had collapsed, and the bell tower went with it. There was no reason for it to ring, no mechanism, no rope, but Margaret heard it. So did the nurse who entered the room moments later, her face pale, lips parted as if she'd walked through a cold mist. She didn't speak, just placed a meal tray down, glanced nervously at the window, then left without a word. Margaret waited for nightfall. She didn't know what she expected. Visions, another dream, perhaps the girl herself. But when darkness settled in, thick and silent, there was only stillness. No bells, no voices, just the old building creaking with age and memory. Then the scratching began. Soft, rhythmic, like nails on old wood, coming from behind the wall near the radiator. She approached, pressing her palm against the peeling paint. The scratching stopped. She held her breath. Then, 3 knocks, deliberate, from the other side. She stepped back. In her dreams, the orphanage never ended. The hallways went on forever. doors lining both sides, every one of them shut, yet whispering. Some shook, some bled light from underneath, and Miriam was always ahead of her, walking barefoot, always just out of reach. "You left us," she would say without turning. "But we never left you." The investigators eventually declared the case closed. An official apology was issued. Compensation funds were quietly organized for any living relatives. The church buried the story under bureaucracy, red tape, and time. But Margaret kept the journal. She made copies. She mailed them to researchers, archivists, anyone who still believed in hidden truths. Most never responded. A few wrote back. One simply sent a note that read, "You shouldn't have opened it again." She stopped sleeping, not because of fear, but because the dreams were more real than waking, more vivid, more honest, and in them, the children. And were not angry anymore. They were watching, waiting. Some even smiled, as if knowing something she didn't yet understand. Margaret moved to a small house on the outskirts of town. No visitors, no phone, just the journal and the silence. But the knocks followed her, in the walls, in the floors. The sound of feet on the attic stairs, though she lived alone. One morning, she opened the front door and found a small object on the step, a rosary made of bone, each bead carved with a symbol she didn't recognize. She took it inside and closed the door without a word. The carvings on the rosary were unlike anything she had seen in her youth, not Latin, not symbols from any known catechism. They were older, angular, almost runic, etched with a precision that suggested ritual rather than artistry. Margaret tried to ignore it at first. She tucked the rosary into a drawer, but every night it returned. On her pillow, by the sink, on the windowsill just above her bed. She began to dream of its creation. Small, pale hands carving bone under candlelight, whispering in unison with voices too faint to understand, but too many to ignore. The last letter she ever sent was to a man named Howard in Vienna, a former Jesuit-turned-symbologist who had dedicated his life to decoding forbidden religious texts. She described the symbols in detail and included a photograph. 2 weeks later, his assistant wrote back. Howard had gone missing the day after receiving the envelope. His notes were scattered across the floor. The photograph of the rosary had been burned, deliberately, and only that photo. Nothing else in the apartment was touched. Margaret stopped writing after that. Neighbors began to talk. Lights on at odd hours, strange sounds from the basement, a feral cat population that seemed drawn to her porch, sitting in perfect rows, staring at the house without blinking. One child swore he saw someone watching him from Margaret's attic window, a girl in white, unmoving, even when he threw a rock at the glass. The pane cracked. The girl didn't flinch. They said Margaret went mad, that she talked to herself, that she hadn't aged in years. But she was never committed. No one dared go inside. No priest stepped forward. The church, now wiser in the age of exposure, kept silent. When she died, if she died, there was no obituary. Just a for sale sign that lingered for years until it rotted in place. When the property was finally seized by the state, they found the house untouched, save for a single room upstairs where the walls were covered floor to ceiling in writing, the same sentence repeated over and over in English, in Latin, in something else. They remember what we bury. And in the center of the floor, a circle made of ash. Inside it, the rosary, clean, unaged, untouched by time. The circle of ash wasn't made from wood or paper. Forensics never identified the substance. It wasn't human, they said, but it wasn't not human either. And when the state workers touched the rosary to remove it, one of them collapsed on the spot. No known illness, no drug in his system. He came to after 11 minutes and never spoke again. Not from trauma, they insisted. Physically, his vocal cords were intact. But he never made another sound. Not even in sleep. The object was taken into evidence. Within 3 weeks, the storage facility in Albany burned to the ground. No accelerants, no survivors. The only thing recovered was a single security tape from the room where the rosary had been stored. The footage showed the lights dimming one by one in sequence. Then came a static hum so deep it cracked the speakers on playback, and in the final 2 seconds just before the screen went black, a faint, unmistakable sound, hundreds of whispers, layered and sharp, like pages turning backward in a burning library. After that, the rosary disappeared again. Rumors claim it resurfaced in a private collection in Bavaria, under the protection of a man known only as the librarian. No photographs, no interviews. Some say he belongs to a lineage of archivists who catalogue not history, but what history forgets. They believe the rosary isn't a relic, but a key, one of several, designed not to sanctify but to awaken. What it awakens, though, no one seems willing to explain. They say the markings on the beads match a second set of symbols found in a monastery deep in the Carpathians, carved into stone walls far older than the structure itself. That monastery has been sealed since 1938, when the last 4 monks inside took a vow of silence and walled themselves into the inner cloister. No one's heard from them since, but once a year, on the night of the winter solstice, villagers still will report chanting echoing down the mountain, low, guttural, not quite human. And always the same phrase, carried on the wind, translated poorly but with chilling intent. The prayer must never finish. Some claim that phrase, the prayer must never finish, was the same uttered by a dying priest in a ruined village outside Naples in 1794. His journal, recovered from beneath the floorboards of a church that hadn't existed on any map for over a century, detailed visitations from an uncloaked saint with eyes like soot and a mouth that did not move. The entity offered no sermon, no scripture, only a single demand: repeat it until the world forgets what silence is. The priest obeyed. For weeks, his congregation reported hearing his voice at all hours, even when he wasn't present. He spoke in a language no one knew but somehow understood, and when he finally stopped, the crops withered and every clock in the village began running backward. Within a month, the entire village was abandoned. Within a year, it vanished completely. The priest's journal was the only thing left behind. No buildings, no roads, not even ruins. Just the journal, lying in a circle of undisturbed snow, the ink somehow fresh despite the cold and still warm to the touch. A linguist at the University of Leiden tried to decode the language in the journal and published his initial findings under a pseudonym. He noted eerie similarities between the priest's chants and a pre-Indo-European dialect theorized to be the root of all human language, one believed to have been deliberately erased from our collective memory. His paper was pulled within days. The linguist vanished the same week. The only thing his colleagues found was a page from the journal nailed to the inside of his office door with a surgical scalpel. On it, written in perfect Latin, were just 2 words: lingua inferna, the tongue of hell. The idea that language could serve as a key, a frequency capable of unlocking something ancient, has surfaced time and again in buried esoteric texts, banned grimoires, and whispered oral traditions. From the 2 Nal glyphs carved into the stones of Nan Madol to the rhythmic patterns of the Voynich manuscript, some researchers believe these are not gibberish, but fragments of a larger, hidden script designed to evoke not understanding, but invitation. Invitation to what remains unclear. But if the prayer is not meant to end, if the chant must never cease, then the implication is even more terrifying, because it means something is always listening. In 1946, a Soviet expedition to the Siberian wilderness stumbled upon what they believed was a lost Tungusic burial site. Instead, they found a crater filled with petrified trees twisted into unnatural spirals, their bark burned black despite no signs of fire. At the center stood a single stone monolith covered in deep grooves that seemed to shift slightly when not directly observed. One of the geologists, a man named Alexei Morozov, made the mistake of touching the monolith with his bare hand. According to his colleagues, he immediately went rigid, then began speaking fluently in a language none of them recognized. He spoke for 13 minutes straight, eyes wide open, tears pouring down his face, before collapsing. He never spoke again. The recordings of his utterances were smuggled out of the USSR decades later and ended up in the hands of a private antiquarian in Vienna, who compared them to the so-called Black Tongue of Baal, a mythic language described in Phoenician fragments said to be used in rituals that predate civilization. The phonetic structure of Alexei's speech matched these fragments almost perfectly, despite being separated by at least 4,000 years. This event, later dubbed the Tunguska Echo, raised serious concerns among certain underground academic circles who feared it proved a long-held theory that beneath the layers of civilization lies an ancient resonance, an echo that, once reawakened, cannot be silenced. Not a myth, but a memory. Something encoded into the fabric of the earth, into our DNA perhaps. Not a god, not a demon, but a survivor. Some believe the monolith was not a monument, but a warning. Not built, but left behind. After Alexei's breakdown, the Soviet team reported hearing rhythmic thumping sounds at night, like a heartbeat coming from beneath the ground. They attempted to leave, but their radio equipment failed, and by the time a rescue team arrived 3 weeks later, they found only frostbitten tents, shattered instruments, and 2 journals, both filled with identical scrawl in the same unknown language. One page had a rough sketch of the monolith. Above it, written in shaking Cyrillic, Nezvuk, Azov. Not a sound, but a summons. In 1879, during the British Raj, a railway tunnel being dug through the Aravalli Hills in Rajasthan came to a sudden halt when workers uncovered a chamber sealed behind a thick wall of fused black stone. It wasn't on any map, and its design bore no resemblance to local architecture. At first, the British engineers believed it to be a natural cave until they entered and discovered carvings. Elaborate, disturbing depictions of limbless humanoid figures bowing to a creature made entirely of eyes and mouths. The walls pulsed with heat, though no fire burned inside. Within hours, several of the workers fell ill, suffering hallucinations of drowning in an ocean made of teeth. Major Charles Withers, the commanding officer overseeing the project, ordered the chamber sealed again. But not before he removed a single artifact, a brass cylinder engraved with spiral glyphs. He kept it in his quarters, claiming it emitted a low hum only he could hear. According to his personal diary, later confiscated by the East India Company, he began to experience vivid dreams of an inverted city beneath the earth, lit by floating spheres and populated by blind priests who moved in synchronized silence. One night, Withers reportedly awoke and found the brass cylinder unscrewed by an unseen force. His servant described him standing in the garden at dawn, motionless, blood trickling from both ears. When he finally spoke, he uttered only one phrase: "It remembered me." 3 days later, he vanished without a trace. His quarters were found in disarray, the walls covered in drawings he couldn't possibly have created alone, intricate blueprints for what appeared to be some sort of biological machine, part flesh, part metal, etched in painstaking detail. The British authorities destroyed the tunnel project and suppressed all records, but the cylinder was never recovered. To this day, locals speak of the Nakni Whale and hear the dancing darkness, and warn travelers not to disturb the soil in that region, not because of curses or spirits, but because, as one old man once whispered to a visiting anthropologist, it hears digging, it learns shapes, and it waits. In 1965, deep within the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a scientific facility known only by its classified codename Vozrozhdeniya 7 conducted an experiment shrouded in layers of Cold War secrecy. Officially, it was a high-altitude atmospheric research center. Unofficially, it was a psychological endurance site testing human limits under extreme isolation. But what made Vozrozhdeniya 7 infamous among Soviet archivists wasn't the conditions. It was the man they called Subject 12. A political prisoner, unknown even in the KGB records, Subject 12 was placed alone in a subterranean chamber carved into permafrost, with no clocks, no windows, and no sound. The experiment was to last 30 days. It ended in 11. At first, guards reported Subject 12 remained calm, spending his hours humming unfamiliar lullabies and stacking rocks brought in for observation. On day 4, microphones picked up whispering, though no one else was present. The whispers spoke in Old Church Slavonic, a language Subject 12 was never taught. On day 6, camera feeds began to distort, showing flickering images of a second figure in the room, always facing away from the camera, always motionless. The guards believed it a trick of the light. On day 8, the figure turned to face the lens. It had no face. When the door was finally opened on day 11, the chamber was empty. Subject 12 had vanished. The rocks were stacked to form a spiral pattern etched perfectly into the floor. The walls were covered in markings resembling cuneiform script from ancient Sumer, but with symbols no linguist could decode. The footage was erased within 24 hours. All involved were sworn to silence, and the facility was officially dismantled. Years later, a Russian academic researching Soviet psychological experiments stumbled upon fragments of the audio recordings, mislabeled in a forgotten archive in St. Petersburg. One snippet, played backward, allegedly contains a voice that repeats a single phrase, "There is no such thing as alone." The researcher died in her sleep 3 weeks later, eyes open, her hands frozen in the same spiral pattern carved on the Vozrojdeniye floor. In 1892, on the outskirts of Vienna, a respected psychiatrist named Dr. Emil Heitzmann operated a small sanatorium known only to those with the means and the desperation to seek it out. The clinic, nestled among dense woods and perpetually shrouded in morning fog, treated patients with what Heitzmann called memory dissonance, a condition not recognized by any official body of medicine. His patients all shared a disturbing symptom, the vivid recollection of lives that weren't their own. They remembered ancient wars they had never fought in, cities that didn't exist, and people no one else had ever met. These weren't delusions. They spoke in dead languages. They drew maps of lost continents. And most unnervingly, they sometimes described each other's visions without ever having met. Dr. Heitzmann documented these cases obsessively. One patient, a seamstress named Clara Donal, recalled being executed in a Roman amphitheater in 71 CE, describing her surroundings with architectural precision, later confirmed by archaeologists decades after her death. Another patient, a mute man named Joseph, carved symbols into the walls of his room that matched the glyphs found in pre-Columbian temples in Central America, structures that had not yet been discovered at the time. Heitzmann became obsessed. He believed that consciousness might be a fragmented collective, shattered across time and space, with trauma acting as the trigger that allowed some people to access these alternate shards. In 1894, he isolated 6 of his most receptive patients and conducted what his notes referred to as Die Brückenkammer, the bridge room. None of them were ever seen again. Heitzmann's notes end abruptly, save for a single page recovered decades later during a renovation of the site. It simply reads, "They are awake, and they remember too much." Today, the remains of the sanatorium have been overt, aching by forest, and no official records of its existence remain. But hikers in the area occasionally find strange objects, coins from no known mint, carvings of cities no one recognizes, and once a perfectly preserved Roman gladius embedded in the earth beneath a tree that had grown around it. In the winter of 1924, a remote Arctic expedition led by Swedish explorer Lars Nyström vanished without a trace. The team, composed of scientists, cartographers, and one reclusive folklorist, set out to chart unrecorded territory north of Svalbard, believing that an unclaimed island, referred to only in 17th century whaling logs as Gromörklandet or the Grey Darkland, might actually exist. Their last known communication was a cryptic radiogram that simply read, "Sky wrong, light wrong, ice screams." Then silence. A year later, a Russian trawler reported spotting what appeared to be an old icebreaker ship frozen into a glacier on a drifting ice shelf. When Soviet authorities investigated, they found Nyström's vessel completely intact, but eerily empty. There were no signs of violence or struggle, just neatly made beds, tables set for meals that were never eaten, and journals half-filled with increasingly erratic handwriting. One entry from the ship's meteorologist reads, "The aurora does not dance here. It waits. It listens." The folklorist's notes were the most disturbing. He had become fixated on a figure from Sami legend known as Iskalbarnet, the Ice Child, a pale, wordless being said to appear during solar eclipses in the far north, drawing those who hear its song into the white wilderness, never to return. No bodies were ever found. However, in 1957, during the construction of an early warning radar installation on the Norwegian side of the Arctic Circle, engineers unearthed something that didn't belong. A silver locket containing a photo of Lars Nyström and his wife, perfectly preserved, buried in permafrost hundreds of kilometers from the last known location of his ship. The locket was found resting atop what appeared to be an ancient humanoid skeleton with elongated limbs and an abnormally large cranium. The bones had no match in any known species, human or otherwise. To this day, the area around Grommerklandet remains uncharted due to what officials cite as extreme magnetic disruption. Satellite images often return blurred or static-ridden when pointed in that direction. Locals who fish near the Arctic edge refuse to speak of the place, but some still whisper of distant songs heard late at night, carried on winds that feel older than the ice itself. In the summer of 1903, a peculiar shipment arrived at the London docks, wrapped in tarpaulin and marked only with the symbol of an hourglass etched into a wax seal. It had been sent from a forgotten monastery in rural Carpathia, along with a note scrawled in archaic Latin warning, "Do not let it be opened during a blood moon." Naturally, the crate was opened immediately by customs officials. Inside was a wooden sarcophagus containing the mummified remains of an unknown figure, neither Egyptian nor Christian in burial style, but instead bound in red cords and buried with a black mirror beneath its head. The mirror was not glass but obsidian, and its surface remained cold to the touch even when exposed to direct sunlight. That same week, a wave of inexplicable madness swept through Whitechapel. At least 7 individuals were committed to asylums within days of each other, each ranting about the eye behind the glass and drawing fractal spiral patterns on the walls of their cells. One of them, a dock worker, gouged out his own eyes and claimed, "Now it can't see through me." The Royal Society of Antiquaries quickly seized the body and the mirror under the guise of national security, locking them away in the British Museum's subterranean vaults that are never shown to the public. A handwritten entry from the museum's off-books inventory system states only, Item 443B, observe with no direct eye contact, responds to lunar cycles, emits low hum during equinox. In 1920, during a rare electrical blackout in London, a security guard stationed in the lower vaults disappeared without triggering any alarms. All that remained were his shoes, placed neatly beside the obsidian mirror, which was found with a single crack down its center. Surveillance later revealed something strange. Frames where the mirror seemed to reflect a chamber that didn't exist, with flickers of movement, as though something on the other side was pacing. Since then, the mirror has been moved at least 3 more times, each location suffering its own share of sudden disappearances and classified incidents. Modern curators at the museum will deny that the artifact ever existed. No official record remains, and yet in a quiet hallway where ancient relics are stored, a locked door bears a rusted hourglass symbol and is said to remain inexplicably cold even in midsummer. Some believe the mirror is still inside, still waiting, still watching for someone who dares to meet its gaze under the wrong moon. In 1871, amidst the bustling reconstruction of post-Civil War America, a series of strange deaths began plaguing the workers of a remote rail line cutting through the forests of northern Montana. Initially dismissed as accidents, crushed limbs, missing persons, unexplained fires, the deaths shared one disturbing commonality. The victims' faces were always turned toward the tree line, eyes wide, mouths open, as if they had seen something so terrifying it froze them in their final breath. Local Blackfoot tribes warned the railroad foreman that the track was cutting through a forbidden hollow, a place where, they said, the air itself whispered in forgotten tongues and shadows walked without hosts. The warnings were ignored, and the rail pushed deeper. A foreman named Jacob Heller began keeping a secret journal, recording strange happenings that escalated from eerie sounds to impossible sightings. He wrote of faceless men walking between the trees and lantern lights that floated 6 feet off the ground, unmoving. Then he wrote of a figure, tall, gaunt, and wrapped in something like bark and soot, that would appear each dusk at the same stretch of track, silently watching the crew. One morning, Heller's journal abruptly stopped after an entry that simply read, "It spoke my name last night, but it wasn't a voice. It was the sound of my mother dying." Months later, the rail company quietly abandoned that section of track, citing unstable terrain. But no geological report was ever filed. Satellite images today show a long straight break in the forest where the rails were laid, and then suddenly ended. The strange part? That stretch of abandoned rail remains completely overgrown, except for a perfect rectangle of land in the middle, about 40 feet long, that nothing grows on. No grass, no moss, no roots. Even in winter, snow refuses to settle there. Locals call it dead length. Few who have ventured there at night speak of hearing train whistles when no tracks remain and the grinding of wheels on steel. Some report a low chanting beneath the wind, a rhythm of words that doesn't belong to any known language. And in the soil, scattered like breadcrumbs, lie rusted spikes and splinters of wood that some claim still vibrate faintly, as if remembering the passing of something that should never have been built. In 1943, at the height of World War II, a strange experiment took place deep in the Nevada desert, far from the atomic tests and public scrutiny. Officially, it was known as Project Cinder, though no such operation appears in declassified military records. Whispers of it came from a single source, the dying confession of a physicist named Dr. Lawrence Grady, who had worked on early electromagnetic propulsion systems for the Navy. In a barely audible voice, he spoke of an experiment not meant to destroy, but to remove, erase something entirely from the fabric of reality. Not a weapon, he said, but a mirror made of silence, designed to reflect nothing back. The facility, built beneath the sand and carved into the base of a rocky outcrop, housed a ring of metallic pylons meant to vibrate at a frequency only theoretical physics could comprehend. The idea, he claimed, was to create a vacuum so complete that it would erase any matter placed inside. The first tests used mice, then monkeys, then human prisoners. Grady's voice trembled when he said, "We didn't kill them, we unmade them. They didn't scream, they vanished, and then the air got colder." After the third human trial, something changed. The chamber began reacting on its own. Objects in the control room vanished. A clipboard, a chair, a technician's hand. The light in the hallway flickered without power surges. People reported seeing versions of themselves in reflection, older, bleeding, or moving independently. Then came the noise. Not a hum, but something like a breathing echo that emerged from within the pylons themselves. One night, the facility lost all communication. By morning, every person inside was gone. The only thing left was Grady, found wandering 20 miles north, eyes milky white and whispering. It followed the silence. Years later, satellite imagery revealed an unnatural depression in the desert. Sand, as if something vast beneath had collapsed. It's still there, perfectly circular, almost 200 feet wide. No plants grow near it. Birds avoid flying overhead. And on the rare occasion someone tries to camp nearby, they report waking up to find their belongings aged, leather cracked, batteries dead, metal rusted. One hiker claimed he saw the desert floor ripple like breath beneath skin. No one goes back twice, and no agency will claim what lies beneath that sand. In the bitter winter of 1952, a small psychiatric hospital nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains was quietly erased from official records. St. Andre's Asylum, once a repurposed monastery, housed only the most unmanageable cases, those whose symptoms were described in the logs as cognitively incompatible with known human behavior. Patients claimed to speak in languages never catalogued, draw symbols never taught, and whisper the names of stars that hadn't yet been discovered. The doctors, at first skeptical, began to unravel. One by one, staff reported vivid hallucinations, entire days spent speaking to patients who, according to colleagues, had died weeks earlier. Objects moved, doors locked on their own, and deep in the chapel-turned ward, a crucifix reportedly began bleeding from the eyes. Then came the arrival of a boy no older than 10. He was found alone at the asylum's front gate in the snow, barefoot and silent, holding a single photograph of the building taken decades before. There was no record of him, no family, no name. He didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't sleep, only stared blankly for hours. Yet in his presence, electrical equipment failed, walls grew warm to the touch, and 2 nurses suffered violent seizures whenever they tried to approach him. The head psychiatrist, Dr. Cosma, claimed in her final journal entry that the boy's breath would fog glass even in heated rooms, and that he sometimes had no reflection at all. Within a month, everyone in the facility was gone. Locals say it was an avalanche, but no snow had fallen for days. When a rescue team climbed the narrow pass, they found the gates wide open, the interior frozen solid despite roaring fireplaces left burning. Every watch and clock on site had stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m. And at the center of the chapel, where the boy had last been seen, was a perfect circle of ash surrounded by claw marks, case etched into the stone. Today, no structure remains. The ground where the asylum once stood is bare, though satellite images often show a strange fog lingering in the area, visible only in infrared. Locals still won't go near the place, and in nearby villages, children are warned of a pale boy who wanders alone, barefoot, holding a faded photograph, always of the building that no longer exists. In the spring of 1879, a forgotten village deep in the Welsh countryside experienced a bizarre, unexplained phenomenon that would never make it into textbooks or official archives. Known only by its ancient name, Caer Glas, it had existed quietly for centuries, steeped in Celtic legend and whispered superstition. But that year, every single inhabitant, men, women and children, vanished overnight. When a mail courier from a nearby town arrived days later, he found the village eerily silent. Food was still on tables, fires were reduced to embers, and animals wandered freely through open doors. But there wasn't a soul in sight, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading out, just the feeling that everyone had stood up mid-sentence and evaporated. The only clue left behind was in the town's tiny chapel. Carved into the wooden altar in jagged, frantic lines were the words, "We listened too long, now it listens back." Nearby, the church's bell rope was torn from the ceiling, as if yanked by something impossibly strong. An investigation was quietly launched, but soon buried. Investigators reported odd auditory distortions, a low, almost melodic hum heard only in the chapel, and dreams of drowning in dark water, even those who had never stepped foot inside the building. A professor of folklore from Oxford who visited the site reportedly began speaking fluent Brythonic, a dead Celtic language, despite having no prior exposure. He later burned every note he'd taken before throwing himself from his college tower. The land where Caer Glas once stood was eventually sealed off by the government, declared unsafe due to unexploded ordnance from a non-existent war exercise. Yet hikers who ignore the warnings and venture close report disorienting experiences, lost time, intense migraines, and in one case, spontaneous nosebleeds after hearing what they described as distant chanting beneath the ground. Even stranger, the village occasionally reappears on outdated maps, not printed but digitally, as if something is rewriting satellite data to include a place that shouldn't exist. Today, the name Caer Glas means nothing to most. But some say if you stand near where the chapel once stood, just before dawn, you'll hear a faint ringing, a bell, they say, still tolling for a village that listened too well and was heard. Would you like me to continue with Section 27? In 1923, a series of disturbing disappearances plagued the crew of a transatlantic cargo ship named the SS Albatross. The vessel, known for its resilience and reliability, departed from Halifax with a full crew and a load of industrial equipment bound for Liverpool. But somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, the ship sent out a single distress message. Not a call for help, but a strange Morse transmission, repeating just one word: hollow. When the ship was finally found adrift a week later, not a single person remained aboard. What was most unsettling wasn't the absence of bodies, but the evidence of life interrupted. Meals half-eaten in the galley, a poker game abandoned mid-hand, cigarettes still smouldering in ashtrays. The logbook ended mid-sentence, as if the captain had been pulled away while writing. But most alarming was the engine room, where claw marks were etched deep into the steel walls, and the main boiler had been shut down manually from the inside, an action that should have sealed the room. Yet the door was wide open, and no one was inside. The ship's return sparked intense naval scrutiny. Divers discovered something peculiar under the hull, a spiral-shaped gouge carved along the metal, as though the vessel had scraped against something immense, smooth and rotating. No known underwater terrain matched the damage. Moreover, the navigation instruments had all been crudely disabled, not smashed, but carefully disconnected and rearranged into a bizarre geometric pattern on the bridge floor. One investigator described it as like a mandala drawn by someone who had never seen land. Some speculated mutiny or pirates, others blamed it on wartime mines still drifting at sea. But survivors from nearby ships whispered of a strange low vibration felt through the hull at night, as if something massive passed beneath them in the dark. There were reports of crew, men hearing a chorus of voices in the water, not loud, not angry, just speaking rhythmically in a language no one knew. Years later, the SS Albatross was decommissioned and dismantled. During scrapping, workers found a sealed compartment behind a false bulkhead, not listed on any blueprint. Inside was a single item, a pristine leather-bound book, completely dry despite years at sea. Its pages were filled with tightly written text, again in no known language, and a hand-drawn image of a massive coiled structure rising from the ocean. The book was quietly confiscated by British intelligence, and every man on the dismantling crew was reportedly paid to relocate and remain unavailable to the press. To this day, sailors in that part of the Atlantic call the region the Hollow Line. They say it's not on any map, but you'll know you're there when the ocean becomes too quiet, when the waves don't break, and the stars above seem to flicker in perfect sync, as if responding to something deep and listening below. Shall I continue with Section 28? In 1931, deep within the pine-thick woods of Oregon, an isolated community known as Grayers Hill abruptly vanished. The town had been founded by a group of mystic Christian separatists in the late 1800s, dozens of families seeking to create what they called a veil between this world and the screaming beneath it. They were quiet, self-sufficient, and wary of outsiders. Their children were rarely seen beyond the forest's edge, and travelers reported hearing strange, low hymns echoing through the woods at dusk, songs with no discernible melody, only a rhythmic, guttural chant that made listeners feel disoriented and ill at ease. A logging company passing through the region first reported something wrong in Grayers Hill. When they arrived to offer trade, they found the town completely abandoned. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no overturned furniture, no indication of where anyone had gone. Food still sat on kitchen tables, laundry hung frozen in the wind, a local schoolhouse had lessons still chalked on the board, but all the desks were empty. The only thing left behind was a massive symbol carved into the town square's dirt, concentric circles wrapped with sharp spiral arms, like a sea creature's eye seen from above. Investigators were disturbed to find every mirror in the town had been shattered, yet all shards were meticulously collected and buried in individual wooden boxes labeled with names and dates that did not match any town records. In the chapel, the Bible had been nailed shut with rusted iron spikes, and a crude phrase had been scrawled in red across the altar. We opened it, and it looked back. The only physical trace of the townspeople was found a mile into the forest, a shallow pit filled with shoes arranged by size, none of which showed wear consistent with their owners having walked barefoot into the wilderness. Search teams found no footprints, but did note an unusual shift in the soil's magnetic properties around the area, and animals refused to enter the tree line. Local wildlife trackers refused to continue the search, claiming the woods had grown too quiet to be alive. After 2 weeks, the investigation was quietly closed and Grayers Hill was erased from public maps. Over the decades, rare hikers who find remnants of the old town report sudden nosebleeds, time distortion, and the sensation of being watched from below, never above, always below. Some claim to hear whispers in languages they do not understand, not carried on the wind but pressed directly into their minds. The surrounding forest has since grown thick with unnatural uniformity. Rows of pine trees growing in perfect spirals, their roots never touching. No bodies were ever found, no answers ever given. Grayers Hill remains a ghost town in every sense but one. Something there still sings after dark. In 1984, a small-town librarian named Eleanor Voss disappeared from the basement archives of the Whitlock Public Library in Maine. What makes her case so chilling isn't just the manner of her vanishing, it's the trail of cryptic clues she left behind, and the rumors that her work had unearthed something the town had tried to forget for over a century. Eleanor was an obsessive archivist with a special interest in local folklore. She spent countless nights cataloging newspaper clippings, parish records, and personal journals, many of which had been sealed in boxes marked "Do Not Open" by order of the Town Council, 1913. According to her notes, Eleanor had become fascinated with a series of strange incidents from the late 1800s involving children in Whitlock who claimed to be hearing stories from under the floor. These children, she wrote, described a voice that knew their secrets, whispered warnings about adults, and asked them to dig down, deeper, past the bones. Several of those children went missing over a 2-year span, and in each case their families received the same anonymous note. The story needed them. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Eleanor began checking out the same handful of books repeatedly, collections of folklore that referenced entities with names like the Archivist Beneath and the One Who Catalogues the Forgotten. She started muttering to herself during work, often speaking in a slow, rhythmic cadence as though reciting from memory. Co-workers claimed she would stare into the library's old heating grates for hours, as if listening. The night she vanished, a janitor reported hearing what he described as 1,000 tiny pages turning at once, coming from the basement. When he investigated, he found the lights flickering and Eleanor's tape recorder sitting on a desk, still running. On the tape was the sound of her voice, wispy, airing, "I found it. It's not a story. It's a reader, and it's hungry." Then, silence. When police searched the room, they found no signs of struggle, but hundreds of pages had been torn from books and arranged into a spiral pattern around a single, open trapdoor in the basement floor, one no one recalled being there before. Attempts to descend into the opening revealed nothing, just a pit that went down far deeper than the building's foundation should allow, vanishing into complete darkness. A camera lowered into the shaft stopped working at 43 feet. The footage it captured before dying showed what appeared to be bookshelves carved directly into the rock walls, filled with volumes bound in what forensic analysts could not identify, something neither leather nor cloth, with lettering that moved subtly when not being watched directly. The library remains open, but the basement is now sealed, and locals refuse to speak of Eleanor. A single photograph of her remains, her smiling in front of the archives, but the bookshelves behind her in the image seem misaligned, subtly wrong, like the perspective is bending inward. Some say if you stare long enough, you'll see something looking back. In 1972, an elderly man named Victor Bell arrived unannounced at a rural hospital in Wyoming, disoriented, dehydrated, and carrying a strange bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He had no identification and gave conflicting answers about where he had come from, alternating between saying he had stepped out of the map and finally closed the last page. When pressed, he claimed to have been a cartographer for something he called the Ministry of Silent Lines, and he warned the doctors not to unwrap the bundle. He said it was a residual path, and that anyone who opened it without knowing the ritual would walk the wrong way forever. Hospital staff, thinking he was delusional but harmless, sedated him and took the bundle to a secure room. Inside, they found what looked like an impossibly detailed, hand-drawn map of North America, but the geography was subtly and profoundly altered. Towns existed where none had ever been recorded. Rivers bent in impossible loops. Whole mountain ranges appeared to be mirrored. And running through the heart of the map, from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, was a faint red line marked only as the reader's vein. Along this line, tiny glyphs were drawn, symbols resembling eyes, keys, and open mouths. That night, the hospital experienced a total electrical failure. Backup generators refused to start. Several patients reported seeing a man made of paper walking silently through the halls, dragging something behind him that scraped against the floor in a slow, steady rhythm. Security footage from that night, what little remained after the blackout, showed frame after frame of warped shadows, elongated figures, and a slow distortion of space, as though the building itself were being redrawn. When power returned the next morning, Victor Bell was gone, no sign of forced entry or exit. The room where the map had been stored was sealed from the inside. And the map itself had changed, now bearing a new symbol drawn in blood-red ink near the hospital's location. An open book with teeth. A nurse who had handled the map quit her job the following day and reportedly began walking south. She was later found hundreds of miles away, her feet torn and bloody, still murmuring that she couldn't stop following the line. She didn't recognize her own name, but she remembered Victor Bell. He wasn't lost, she whispered. He was hiding, and now the map remembers. The hospital tried to cover the incident, labeling it a breakdown and mass hysteria, but rumors spread, and a handful of urban explorers who later broke into the hospital's archives to find the map reported a strange compulsion to walk in circles or down hallways that shouldn't have existed, as if the building itself was folding in on them. None of them found the map, but they did find one thing scratched into the plaster of the walls in a looping hand over and over. The reader draws the route, you only think you choose it. In the spring of 1954, a woman named Lillian Krause moved into a boarding house in Salem, Massachusetts. She was quiet, polite, always dressed in black, and paid 6 months' rent in advance, with crisp, uncirculated bills. The landlady, Mrs. Donnelly, noted something odd immediately. Lillian brought no furniture, no suitcase, only a large old trunk sealed with iron clasps and lined with unfamiliar runes burned into the wood. She placed it in the center of her room and instructed no one to touch it under any circumstances. She even nailed the door shut from the inside and communicated with the outside world only by sliding notes beneath the door. At first, the other tenants were curious, but soon they noticed a pattern. Every night, precisely at 3:33 a.m., a strange sound would echo through the house, something between a low moan and the rustling of dry leaves. Lights would flicker, and sometimes the plumbing would groan like a deep voice trying to speak underwater. On more than one occasion, tenants woke to find strange symbols scrawled on their mirrors in condensation, symbols that would vanish before anyone else could see them. Mrs. Donnelly tried to check on Lillian several times, but the room remained locked from the inside. And yet, every Friday, a note would appear beneath her door, neatly written, always on yellowed parchment, requesting a list of unusual items: crushed bone, unblessed soil, the ashes of any book older than 50 years. She always paid generously. Mrs. Donnelly never asked questions. One morning, after nearly 6 months, Lillian's door was found wide open. The trunk was gone, her bed undisturbed, no sign of struggle, but in the center of the floor, perfectly centered, was a single sheet of that same parchment with just one line written in blood-red ink: "The tenant has been reclaimed." Authorities searched the house, but no one could find any trace of Lillian. Her identity couldn't be verified. No records of her existed, no social security number, no birth certificate. The handwriting on her notes didn't match any known style, and forensic linguists claimed the syntax resembled no modern language. But one tenant, a retired librarian, recognized the symbols found on the mirrors. He claimed they were an archaic form of sigil used in forbidden 17th-century grimoires, specifically those attributed to a secret sect known only as the Indexed Flesh. A year later, another woman checked into a boarding house in Providence, Rhode Island. She paid 6 months in advance, brought only a single iron-clasped trunk, dressed all in black. Her name, according to the ledger, was Lillian Krause. On a fog-choked morning in 1962, in a small fishing village off the coast of Maine, the sea coughed up something that would be whispered about for decades, but never officially recorded. Fishermen hauling in their nets found them tangled not with fish, but with something far older: ropes of human hair, slick with brine, knotted with old coins from forgotten empires, and bones not quite human. The townspeople, already superstitious from generations of sea myths and ghost stories, gathered on the dock in silence as the nets were brought ashore. No one dared to speak when one of the fishermen began to scream, clawing at his face, shouting that, "She's in the water, staring through me, through my soul." That man, John Merrick, would never speak again. He was taken inland to a sanitarium near Portland, where he spent the rest of his days drawing endless spirals on the walls, each identical, each perfectly round, each with a single black dot in the center. But the village didn't forget. Within days, families began leaving. Boats were abandoned mid-harbor. By the time investigators arrived 2 weeks later, the town was completely empty. Meals still sat on tables. Radios played static in empty kitchens. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of mass evacuation, just silence, and the thick, wet fog that never seemed to lift. All that was ever found was a journal, waterlogged and half-burnt, belonging to a girl named Elsie Harrow. Her final entry read, "She is not from the sea, but below it. Beneath the mud, beneath the bones, beneath the first song the earth ever sang. She is waking." The government deemed the village a hazardous zone due to a chemical spill and cordoned it off. Satellite images now show a neat grid of blacked-out squares where the village used to be, as though someone is still trying to erase it, pixel by pixel, memory by memory. But every few years, one reports hearing bells out at sea, not foghorns but bells, deep, echoing, and impossibly rhythmic, and always at night, always when the tide is lowest. Sailors say they dream of a pale woman with black eyes and seaweed for hair, whispering in an ancient tongue. She tells them things, secrets they should not know, names they should not say. One man even carved those names into his own chest before throwing himself into the Atlantic. His body was never recovered. And sometimes, just sometimes, pieces of that village wash ashore hundreds of miles away. Half a rocking chair, a rusted sign, a child's shoe still damp with salt water. All of them perfectly preserved. All of them marked with that same spiral. There's a lighthouse off the coast of Black Hollow, a skeletal thing of iron and glass, untouched by rust or time. Mariners say its light hasn't worked in over a century, yet on certain nights when the fog curls low and the moon is veiled, the beacon flares to life, not with ordinary light, but something colder, blue-white, pulsing like a heartbeat. And always, just before it begins, there's a sound, not the crashing of waves, not the screech of gulls, but singing, wordless and distant, carried on wind that smells of decay and lilies, like a funeral wrapped in perfume. The lighthouse has no records, no builder, no keeper, no origin in any archive. Yet it stands. Boats that drift too close report sudden equipment failure. Radios turn to static, compasses spin. Worse are the reports of time lost. Sailors swear hours vanish in minutes. Some claim to have seen their own boats from the outside, drifting next to them in the mist, crewed by perfect doubles with empty eyes. Others have found themselves moored back on land with no memory of sailing home, only the sense of having drowned and been pulled back from somewhere unspeakably far. There's a theory whispered among coastal salvage crews and deep-sea divers that the lighthouse isn't a beacon at all, but a seal. A lock meant to hold something beneath, not under the sea, but under memory, under reality itself. A weight placed by hands older than time to keep something asleep. Something whose name doesn't exist in any language, but whose presence can be felt when you look too long into still water and feel it looking back. In 1987, a diver named Lane Morrison went missing near the lighthouse. His camera washed up days later. The last image was of the base of the tower, but in the reflection of his visor, someone, or something, was standing behind him. Humanoid, elongated, fingers like kelp strands, mouth open in a silent scream. Arm. The image was dismissed as pareidolia, shapes made by shadows and distortion, but the photo was quietly sealed by the Navy and has never surfaced again. Locals say on the anniversary of Morrison's disappearance, the water around the lighthouse bubbles gently, like something breathing just beneath. They say the air gets heavier, thicker, and anyone who hears the singing must not respond, not even in thought. Because it doesn't just want to be heard, it wants to know you're listening, and once it knows your name, it will never stop calling it. So if you ever find yourself sailing alone, and the fog rolls in too fast, and your compass begins to tremble, and you hear that low, haunting hum rise from the deep, turn away. Cut your engine. Don't look toward the light, because the sea does not forgive, and some things buried in the dark are not meant to wake. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more unsettling tales from the shadows of history and beyond. And if you've ever heard a strange song on the wind or seen a light where there shouldn't be one, let us know in the comments. Your story might just be darker than fiction. Thanks for watching Sepia Secrets, where the past never stays buried.